Hello, Assalamu alaikum. I think we'll begin our session at this point. We'll have about a minute before we'll start. I just want to ask everybody, just from the start, that if you're at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, the developments of the coronavirus, COVID-19, across the globe and its geopolitical impacts. This will be one of our first live online sessions with our friends of the center and with experts. We'll be discussing the most significant arena in which the coronavirus has impacted geopolitical relations, which is the United States. I will begin by giving some brief facts that we all know and we have been bombarded with, but just to set the tone before I hand over the session to our main speaker, Dr. Sami Al-Arian. The first case of coronavirus, as everybody knows, occurred in the state of Washington on January 20th. Since at that point, there was the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation, had reported that the United States had 2.8 hospital beds for every 1,000 people. This was significantly lower than their European counterparts, such as Germany, who had 8 hospital beds for every 1,000 people, or South Korea, which had the highest number, which was 12.3. China at this time was also significantly higher, almost double than the United States. However, the United States, in comparison to other countries going into the virus, had a lot more ICU beds. But even despite the fact that the United States had higher ICU beds than others, there were many questions about the ability of the United States to handle such a widespread healthcare disaster, given its privatized healthcare system. The response of the United States has been mixed and quite confusing at the beginning. At this point, I think the administration has come to understand the significance of the virus. So we will be discussing this timeline of the events and the response of the government, and also the impact of the United States' response in terms of the world, especially the economic fallout of the virus, and the way that it places the United States in world affairs in comparison to other rising powers such as China. So that was my brief introduction. I want to welcome you all, for those who have just joined in. Let me say this, that we will have about an hour of presentation by Dr. Sami Al-Arian, and then we will reserve the last 30 minutes for question and answer. If you could save your questions for that time. Until then, I would request that you keep your mics at on mute. And if you have anything that you would like to intervene, if you can't hear something or you have technical problems, you could type it into the chat section of the group, and I will try to convey that to the speaker or intervene on your behalf. Because we have a lot of participants, it's very important that we try to just keep our mics muted. At this time, let me introduce Dr. Sami Al-Arian. He is the director of our institute, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. He has spent a lot of time writing on geopolitical issues and also been active in politics in the United States. Many of you already know him. At CIGA, under his leadership, we have established many working groups that study the world from the region's perspective. At CIGA, he has done a monumentous job in establishing, I think, a very unique center in the Muslim world, which takes the Ummah as an analytical category and centers it in the world from where we can begin to think about the role of Muslims and their interests in a very complex and globalized environment. Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's not very pleasurable to talk to you over the internet, but that's the seems like that's our normal now. Our talk today is about the US and the pandemic, the coronavirus. So I will try to be brief. You know, I don't like to speak for an hour, but if it takes us that, we will do it. We will use the time. But I would like to make some.
Could I ask Mr. Junaid to stop sharing his screen? I'm not really sure if it's possible for us to focus the camera back on Dr. Sami. Okay.
All right. So for the past 6 weeks or so, we have now over 2 billion people at least isolated and confined to their home. This is an unusual situation for the world, certainly, but it's not unusual for the world in history. When we go back, we'll find that pandemics existed throughout history. Perhaps two of the most famous one is the Justinian Pandemic in the 6th century, which probably was the reason for the fall of the Byzantine Empire. And it affected the whole world, especially in Europe, the Middle East, as far as also the Sassanid Empire, which gave rise to the Islamic Empire that came in its aftermath. The other one, of course, it's estimated that about maybe 40–50% of Europeans died in that pandemic. Also, we have the one in the 14th century, the Black Death, which at least 75 to 200 million people just in Europe alone were affected. Also here in Turkey, in the Ottoman, there were Ottomans there, but the reason the Ottomans also rose is because it was the 14th century pandemic was one of the reasons for the fall of the Holy Roman Empire as well as the Byzantine Empire before that. So pandemics are not rare. I mean, they do occur every few centuries. So it's not a rare event in history, but it does happen and its impact is great. About a century ago, we also had the Spanish flu, which also many millions, perhaps as many as also 50 to 100 million people estimated to have died. So what we have now is certainly a big challenge, a monumental challenge. So I will try to restrict my talk just to the US mainly and its how it's been impacted, being the largest and most powerful country in the world, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I will talk about 4 aspects primarily. I mean, each aspect could take hours to talk about, so I'll try to restrict it just to give highlights or some observations. I'll talk about how it was dealt in the health sector, in the socioeconomic situation, politically, how it will impact, and also geopolitically. When we look at the health side of it, we see colossal, huge failure. As Awais pointed out, we had the first case reported in the US was on January 20th, the same date, or maybe a day apart with South Korea. And what happened here is that now we're into the third month. So this is about almost 10 weeks. Sorry, about 12 weeks since the first coronavirus was reported in both countries. We have 120,000 cases, over 120,000 cases in the US, with over 45,000 deaths, with about roughly 82,000 recoveries. So that's a rate of about 5.5% dead, about 10% recovery, and about 84% still suffering. And this is only those who have been tested. On the other hand, if we go to South Korea, yes, South Korea is 52 million, while the US is 330 million. So it's about 1/6 of the population, but they don't have 1/6 of the cases. They have roughly about 10,700 cases with only 238 dead. That's 0.2% of death rate, mortality rate, rather than 5.5%. And with 8,300 recovering from the 10,700, which is about 78% recovering rather than 10%. So if we look at the infection rate, what the professionals would give a number. Again, to put it in comparison, the infectious rate for the US is about 250, while in China it's about 5. Even some people doubt that number, and South Korea is about 20. That's the infection rate, not the death rate. Death rate is much, much lower. So even though both cases were reported essentially at the same time, there are major differences. And I would like to point out some of these differences. By the end of March, which would have been about roughly 70 days into this pandemic, or at least the start of the first case in both countries, the Koreans had tested about 4,000 per million. And they were able to get around the problem, the source of the problem, and deal with it while preparing the public for the treatment and the different policies that they had to adopt in order to get in order to get control over that virus. Was about 5 in a million. That's 4,000 in a million versus 5 in a million tests. The discrepancy, of course, because the genome of the virus, it's the makeup, the virus is it's RNA makeup, which will get the experts to test it, was already figured out by January. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a something that was unknown. They already knew about it, but it was a political failure to make these decisions. And the reason you need testing certainly is to be able to understand who is infected, where the infection occurred, and how the virus is being transmitted, so that you can get control over it. And that's why testing is very important. So we're dealing with a dysfunctional system at the very beginning, at the very start, because of the lack of political will and also vision to deal with it. It was, for example, I mean, on February the 10th, the federal budget was released. The federal budget was released 20 days into this challenge, into this pandemic, and yet that budget was calling for a reduction of the budget of the CDC and the NIH and other healthcare facilities and research. Just imagine, the disconnect between those who are making decision makers, and the reality on the ground. The other aspect is, this is a manifestation of the neoliberal capitalist system. We are talking about the privatization of healthcare, and this has been a trend that has been going on now since the 80s, since Reagan came to power. We've seen how the privatization of health and the privatization of education, of the prison system, and other aspects of society, by delinking, or at least by having deregulations and taking the government out of basic services and basic aspects of people's lives. So when you look at ventilators, the problem of ventilators as an example, the federal government back in 2011 was because they do have these scenarios sketched out. And they had the scenario of a pandemic that is going to affect the lung and affect the breathing system and the respiratory system within human beings. And they were trying to find a company that would buy, or they can get about 40,000 ventilators. They were eventually able to make a contract with a small company. That company's name was Ovidian Newport Medical Instruments. And they contracted with them, and they called them to build mobile ventilators where they can be easily transportable. However, a bigger and a larger company by the name of Covidian, who thought that if this smaller company is able to turn that many ventilators with a small margin of profits, that will cut into their own profits. So they went, and about a year later, in March 2012, after the design was approved by the federal government, after the contract was signed, they bought this Newport company for about $108 million, I believe. And they were able to basically, they asked for more money, which the federal government didn't give them because they asked for much more money. They were doing their own fancy type of ventilators. So eventually that project was scrapped. And, we can see the problems, the effects of that the US today does not have enough ventilators for its sick population. That is not a problem that is unique to this. This is a problem that has been taking place in every major drug that is popular or is needed by the population. For example, we can find many drugs such as, let's say, hemophilia, as an example. That drug cost thousands and thousands of dollars. So there was this particular company that developed drug therapy as a one-time cure. So we found another company, Roche, I think Roche, the pharma company. They bought this smaller company by the name of Spark Therapeutics in order to put them out of business. So they buy them, they put hundreds of millions of dollars, they buy them so that they can put that drug that's going to benefit the population and save money on the government, on the people, so that they can sell their own patented drug for many, many, many times over. So this is one manifestation of how capitalism has been affecting the basic necessities in life. And we can go on examples talking about the privatization of the prisons, the privatization of education, the privatization of many aspects of life. Now, there is another aspect to this that has been widely reported also, which is the impact of this virus on Black people, African Americans. And there is a reason for that. There were many reports that showed, for instance, that while a city like Milwaukee in Wisconsin, 26% of the Black people are, the population of African Americans in that city is 26%, but the death rate of those who died out of the coronavirus was 70%. Louisiana, 32% population, African American, death 70%. Chicago, 32%, death 67%. So it's very consistent. Illinois, 14% of the population in the state of Illinois are African American, yet 46% of the casualties are African Americans. Michigan, same rate, 14, and with death rate of 41. North Carolina, 2138. So you can go on and on and on. Every state you will find, with maybe one exception. So with every state, you'll find that there's a huge gap between the population and the death rate. Of course, there are reasons for that. Trump was saying that no one knows why this is happening, as if that there is some kind of a mystery, some kind of genetic formation that makes Blacks more susceptible. But the answer is very simple. It's because the urban areas are much more infected than the rural areas or the suburban areas. That's one aspect. The other aspect, you'll find that because of poverty, many of these blacks are not insured. They do not have the health care needed for them to go and get treatment on time, especially at the beginning where testing was not available. And it was very hugely expensive for those who would like to even pay for it. At the time, it was in the hundreds and the higher hundreds of dollars. I remember one person who came from the US and told me that the testing was, she told me it was about $900 to test for that coronavirus. At the beginning, no one, certainly these people are not able to afford it. They also have obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, risk factors, which are more common among African Americans than they are among the wider population, which makes them more susceptible. Their immune system is much weaker, so they will be more susceptible to be victims to the coronavirus. We also about the healthcare facilities, which cater to the African American communities in these urban areas are outdated. They are poorly managed. They don't have the resources to deal with this virus. So we can go on and give more examples, but you could see that how this particular situation was never dealt with, and given the proper proper resources, and I will talk about economics in a minute, or the attention it needed to be for pre-planning for these things to be actually predicted. There were many reports about a section within the National Security Council that was developed during Obama's years, in which one person, and she was in charge of it, and there were many other people helping her, and that was actually closed by Trump in the year that he became president, because he didn't think that there was a need for it. Of course, it's a political decision that now a lot of people are paying the price for it. So to make it, to end this section, talking about the health factor, that there are, the US is supposedly the highest country in the world that spends its money on healthcare. About 25% of the economy is spent on healthcare. When we talk about economy, we're talking about GDP of approximately $20 trillion. So about $5 trillion are being spent on the healthcare of Americans, and yet when this challenge came, it was colossal failure. It was a disaster. Lack of ventilators, lack of beds, emergency beds, lack of drugs, lack of testing, you name it. And why is that? Because when we talk about $5 trillion, we're not talking about an actual healthcare that is being provided to the people. We're talking about insurance companies. We're mandated that these would, that people would have to pay insurance companies to cover their health care. There's a lot of it going into really theft and fraud. I remember back in the early 2000s, when this became during the Bush era, the younger Bush era, where it became, many of these regulations were knocked down. One doctor in the city of Tampa of Indian descent, he was able to establish his own insurance company and make deals with the federal government and with doctors in order to save money. And he was able to turn a $1 million company into $600 million company because of how much profit he was making out of this. So there's a lot of money that is being spent, but it's not really spent on healthcare. Similarly, we could talk about pharma, the pharma industry, and I gave you a few examples about some of these. And I remember one of the officials within the insurance company, he was telling me one day how sometimes the pharmaceutical companies make 10,000% on a particular drug because they develop. And the whole thing is not really about doctors, it's really about profits. It's not about providing healthcare, it's about how to make money. So when we make people's health as a commodity in a capitalist system where the only thing that is of real value of money and material things, that would be the end result. So that's one sad, tragic aspect of capitalism, when these essential and basic necessities in life are no longer measured in terms of human needs, but rather in dollars and cents. The second aspect I would like to address this is the economic impact, economic aspect. The US today, or at least before the virus spread, had a workforce of about 157 million. In the Depression years, which always looked at as the worst possible economic catastrophe that could befall a society, the workforce or the labor force between between the 1929 and 1930 were about 50 million. So the Great Depression took place between 29 and 32 for about 3 or 4 years. And the economy lost about 13 million, about 25% unemployment rate. The second example of a Great Recession that took place about a half century later in December of 1982, when it hit hard, where the unemployment rate was about 10.8 or about 11%, which was the highest since 1948. I remember in 1 week, there was a loss of about 685,000 jobs. And that was considered one of the highest, if not the highest, even though in 2009, which is the next recession that took place after the waning days of Bush, after the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers and the financial catastrophe that took place, there were about, the labor force was about 130 million, and the loss over 3 years was about 9 million. So we're talking about close to 9 million losses of jobs over 2.5 years in the 2008-2009 crisis. We're talking about 13 million lost in the Great Depression. Yet, when we look at this to put it in perspective about what the US economy is going through now, it blows anybody's mind. It's outside these even numbers. We're talking about workforce about 157 million in 1 week. In 1 week, if the record before was about 700,000, 1 week in March, there was a loss of 6.6 million. 6.6 million people were out of work. In the month of March, there was 22 million jobs lost. If during the 2009-2010 recession, we lost 9 million over 2.5 years, here we lost 22 million over 4 weeks. These are major numbers that it's very difficult even to contemplate and imagine, let alone to deal with. We have now approximately, if these numbers are true and they have been reported by the government, about 14% unemployment, which is unprecedented since the Great Depression. And there are some estimates that it may go as even upwards of 30%. That's why the government went and had these unbelievable, what they call stimulus packages, which is nothing but printing money. And that's one of the aspects of one of the measures that we can look at when we talk about the American empire and its impact on the world. I mean, hopefully we'll give another lecture where we talk about how the US became the way it is, you know, under the title, The Geopolitics of the US, hopefully within a few weeks. But suffice it to say that when we talk about the US today, it's the only country in the world that can print money without major consequences. And that's one of the privileges, one of the perks of being an empire, that they are not held accountable. All the rules that other countries and other societies have to live by, they do not apply to the US because of many reasons. And I will try to go over some of these reasons. First of all, when you look at the public debt, they will talk about debt crisis, and I've been talking about this for decades, but nothing happens. But just look at how that debt developed between the first president, George Washington, in 1789, until Richard Nixon, when he resigned, who is the 37th president, 1974. We had a debt, public debt, of about $470 billion. Half of this debt was acquired during World War II, during FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And between 74 and 81, when we talk about two presidents, Carter and Ford, they doubled that debt. It reached about 1 trillion by the early presidency of Reagan. And then for the next 12 years, we're talking now about President 40 and 41, we had about, in 12 years, we tripled that debt from 1 trillion into $3 trillion. So it became now $4 trillion. 3 trillion were acquired during the presidencies of Reagan and Bush. And between 93 and 2001, when the US was basically the sole superpower, where people are talking about the peace dividends, where Clinton actually put all his efforts in order to enlarge the capacity of the US when globalization was taking shape under the leadership and direction of the United States by knocking down all the trade barriers around the world and expanding American industry and exports. Yet he added another $1.6 trillion to the deficit, where it became 5.6 trillion. And during Bush, where his emphasis was on expanding US power and hegemony through military means around the world, he added 4.4 trillion. So the debt at the end of Bush was $10 trillion. And then during Obama, when he inherited the recession from Bush and trying to recalibrate American foreign policy abroad, that in 8 years, that deficit went from 10 trillion to 20 trillion. In other words, it doubled. And now within the last 4 years of Trump, he was adding $1 trillion every year. So now it's about $24 trillion, and does not even include the coronavirus. Now, again, to put it in perspective, when the recession hit in 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis, the stimulus package was about, first of all, they had $700 billion of bailout to banks who were about to collapse. That was done in the waning days of Bush. And then Obama came and added $850 billion of money that was handed pretty much to businesses and different corporations and different institutions over 3 years. Between the 2009 through 2011, few were given to people out directly as cash or tax reductions. This is $850 billion over 3 years. Compare that to today. We are in our 4th stimulus package now. We have on March 6th, there was $8.3 billion of the first installment. That it is just to help with testing and health care facilities. 2 weeks later, on March 19th, there was another $100 billion. And then 8 days later, there was $2.3 trillion. And yesterday, the Senate passed another $500 billion. We're talking about close to $3 trillion in about a month. And it has already been spent. You know, most of that $2.3 trillion, they were complaining yesterday that $350 billion was given to small businesses, and that has evaporated. That has gone. That is gone. And it's just amazing. It's mind-boggling when you know that most of this money actually is given to banks, and through banks, they are given to loans that would be forgivable to corporations and to small businesses and to other entities. Now, no other country could do that. And why can the US get away with it? Very simple, because they can print the money without consequences. How did they achieve that is a story by itself. And certainly that story begins about a century ago with the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, obviously, you know, before the Federal Reserve, you know, every bank was issuing their own, as a capital society, their own notes. That's why it's called bank notes. And they basically cover that banknotes, because these are papers that are worth nothing except that you trust that whoever is giving you that note, that they will be paid. So they wanted to unify this whole system. So they put that under the Federal Reserve. They gave it the power and authority to print money. And then simply after decades, they can, you know, they pegged it against the gold in the Bretton Woods Agreement during the World War II. And then in 71, Nixon took that because they needed more money. They couldn't cover that with gold. It was uncovered. And then with the projection of power and with the projection of the political influence and economic influence around the world, they are able to convince the whole world that they need to support the American dollar by basically using American dollar. So today we have about close to $20 trillion of trade around the world, and about 62% of it is being used in dollars, even though the US uses only about $4 trillion between export and imports. But if 60% of 20%, that's over $12 trillion, that means the world wants $8 trillion. They buy $8 trillion from the Treasury, from different private institutions, so that they can finance how they deal with each other. So for the dollar being the reserve currency in the world, that's basically American power. When that moment ceases, if the dollar is no longer the reserve currency in the world, then the whole US empire would collapse. That's why they need to invest $700 to $800 billion a year, every single year, on defense, so that they can maintain that status, because the US is living way beyond its means. The global economy is about $80 to $81 trillion. This is in nominal dollars, about maybe 127 in purchasing power parity, but that's another story. And the US is about 1/4 of that, yet the use of the dollar around the world is much more than that. So it's basically a system that sucks the world's wealth dry. And for the US to be able to go and print $3 trillion and spend it in a matter of weeks is unheard of, while the dollar itself is not affected. It's not being affected. Actually, it's still as strong as it has ever been. Now, this is only one aspect, of course, because they think they can get away with it. They do not have to pay anybody back. They print the money and they take notes from each other. So the Congress tells the Federal Reserve, we need this amount of money. They raise the ceiling. The Federal Reserve prints the money. It goes back and charges the US government, the Treasury, percent, 1%, 0.5%, whatever it is. They pay them back. It's all paper money. It's all on paper. Nothing actually is. There's no wealth created here. This is all created out of thin air. Add to that also, when we talk about this situation, that in addition to all the trillions that the government actually spends, the Federal Reserve created its own money supply, almost to the tune of $4 trillion. This is another $4 trillion that it is loaning not only to US banks, but to banks around the world to maintain the superiority of the dollar. So any country in the world that needs money, the federal, and this is against the guidelines, by the way. They are doing this in an emergency situation. They're just creating money, and they are just multiplying that impact. So if you are a banker and you're getting $100 billion from the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank in the US, and you are loaning these $100 billion, and even at a very small rate, even at 1%, that bank is making $1 billion with zero capital. They didn't have to invest a penny, and yet they are making more money. And of course, at one point, somebody has to pay the bills, and mostly it's the American people that will have to pay it. But so far, they don't have to, because it's just accumulating. We have today, by the end of this crisis, we may have as much as $30 billion. Add to that another $30 trillion. Add to that another $30 trillion in private debt. Now, that would make that society reaching almost 300% of debt rate versus what they have at 60 trillion. And if your economy is 20 trillion, and economists say that once you reach the 90%, you are at the red zone, and once at the orange zone, and once you reach 120%, then you are at the red zone, where things could actually collapse. So the economic situation is not rosy yet. The only reason it is sustainable and it exists is because of the fact that there is no other alternative right now, and all attempts to change that system have been resisted. Even though we can discuss at the end the geopolitical situation, why Trump could actually be the catalyst for this system to collapse, because certainly he is not playing by the same rules as other US presidents and leaders have in the past. To summarize this section of my talk, the US, economically speaking, is in a very precarious, very difficult situation. We haven't even talked about the transformation of many industries and the problems with technology itself, because one of the sources of power certainly is technology. Yes, US still is a very powerful country, has a lot of technology companies that at the state of the art, but they're also losing ground to other powers like China and others, certainly in the 5G realm, which 5G is going to transform the whole world. 5G, which depends on fast speed communications, AI, artificial intelligence, also on the Internet of Things, the control of the whole communication systems and the whole infrastructure, the digital highway and so on and so forth. The US is lacking in that because of also the policies that neoliberal capitalism have been pushing, and globalization. And that's one thing that I think the US now is trying to correct by either buying new technologies, by also stopping the Chinese company Huawei from taking a hold into Europe and the US. It's a whole another field that we can talk about. But now, when we talk about technology, also that the US is not alone in that field. There's a lot of competition, and that is posing serious challenges to US leadership, both politically, geopolitically, and technologically. Also, we're talking about shipping lanes. You know, when you have 2 billion or more people, you know, no work and they are housed, and we're talking about the problem with supply chains, the problem with agriculture, with food supply, you know, the whole pop and mom shops, now they're talking in Georgia about opening, barber shops and nail salons and others, because these people cannot survive. These are people paying from, living from paycheck to paycheck. The US has been basically neglecting many of its populations. We have over 40, perhaps 50 million people at the poverty line in the US, meaning that they do not have more than $1,000 in their account. One of these stimulus packages is to pay people $1,200. Believe me, that $1,200 is going to go a long way for some people in these houses. You have about 40% of the US population who cannot claim to own anything. So there's massive poverty, and if that system is clogged, if that system is halted, is collapsing, then this is going to will have a massive socioeconomic consequences in riots in the streets and others. So this is an important thing to know. And yesterday, the oil prices even totally collapsed. And one reason for that is industry is no longer working. The factories that produce cars and produce big machineries, all this has stopped. And that's what they're trying to do with these huge $1 trillion packages, is to pay these companies so they can pay at least part of their workforce, so that they don't have this massive collapse of the system. That's how difficult and how dangerous the situation is. So all the talk about this being a conspiracy, I don't buy that, for a simple reason: is that the whole system is collapsing, even though those who have money may find opportunities during these difficult times. Talk about states and localities, cities and states and counties, where they depend on their revenues from taxes. Now, these are not the federal government. They cannot print money. All they could do is tax people so that they can spend on these services. Now we have double whammy. They have been hit twice. Once by the lack of revenue. Florida, for example, Florida gets its revenue mainly from tourism. That has collapsed. That stopped. So they can no longer claim the 8.5% or whatever they're getting from tourists. You have the different people also. They cannot pay the local taxes. And then talk about not only you're hit from that, but there are more services that are needed, especially in the healthcare. That's why the federal government, and that's why the Democrats today are trying to push hard to help these. That's another $1 trillion or $2 trillion that hasn't been even discussed to help these localities. So this is a major hit, and that's just in the past month. When we talk about the political aspect, which is the third aspect, as I said, I'll talk about 4 aspects. We're talking about a complete collapse and deterioration of democracy. The political system in the US has become dysfunctional. It has been dysfunctional now for over 20 years. elections, even though they, people in the US would like to say that this is the best or the strongest democracy in the world. The fact of the matter is that it has been declining and deteriorating. The more you go up the ladder in terms of the federal government, the less democracy you see. And a very simple example. Let's take the what happened 2 weeks ago. $2.3 trillion is being approved by Congress. By far the largest package that has ever been approved in U.S. Congress. Not a single discussion, no discussion whatsoever. And it was even passed without a vote. They have this rule that says that if people, if one person in Congress, if two people in Congress are in the hall, and one of them call for the passage of a bill, and there are no challenges to it, then it passes, even if you have only two people. So what kind of democracy is that? So one person drove, a congressman drove from Kentucky, Republican guy, and he came to the chamber of Congress, to the well of the House, and he wanted to speak so he can challenge this, so it cannot pass, and he wouldn't even be allowed to speak. And yesterday, the same thing happened. $500 billion was passed in the Senate without any debate and without any vote. So obviously, people could argue that these are unnormal times, but that's not just for this case, because we have an archaic system. Donald Trump had become president even though he lost the popular vote. So you have an electoral system that favors certain minorities over the will of the people, which democracy is supposed to be about. By the way, I mean, for the past, since at least 30 years, the US presidential system has been decided by a handful of states. California, the largest state, no one campaigns in California, because we already know, because this is not about the number of people, this is about the majority of a given state. So no presidential candidate would ever campaign in California, the largest state, or Texas, the next largest state, or New York, the next largest state. All these, the three largest states in the US, which house approximately, over 40% of the people, no one actually campaigns there. In fact, there are no campaigns in about 42 or 43 states now for several elections, because we know exactly who's going to win these states. So the US presidential system then becomes a contest over 7 or 8 states, namely Florida, because these are what's called the swing states. Sometimes they can vote Democrat, sometimes they can vote Republican. Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire. These 8 states are what's going to determine who the next president is, because all other states, we know who's going to win, whether it's Biden on the Democratic side or Trump on the Republican side. So we're talking about 538 electoral votes. Right now, about 222 are the Democrats are going to almost guaranteed to get. 204 almost the Republicans are guaranteed to get. But the other 8 are up in the air. That, Trump could win actually by losing 10 million votes. He could still be the next president. All what he has to do is to win Florida, which is trending Republican, win North Carolina, which is trending Republican, win Arizona, which is always Republican. And now they have few, sometimes they just voted Democratic Senate, but they can do it. And that's how does that happen? Money and politics, because the Supreme Court, that's another manifestation of the deterioration of democracy. The Supreme Court has been, most of them appointed by Republicans. And if the next president is Trump, this is going to alter all the legal aspects in the US for the next at least 50 years, because now we have 5 solidly conservatives and 4 mildly liberal, and these out of the 4 they may lose 2, and if Trump appoints the next 2, then that's it. They would have locked completely the judicial system in the US, which will make it very difficult to advance any kind of policies that would be in favor of the people. This would be in favor of the corporations, the private industry, capitalism, conservative ideology, and so on and so forth. So this is going to have a major, this election is going to have a major impact on what's going to happen in the future. We haven't even touched on the surveillance state, the state that emerged after 9/11. We have seen how that state has taken hold, where they are talking now about how to control those people who were infected by tracing them, by knowing everything about them. And when we talk about the fifth generation, the 5G, the 5G technology, then we're talking about a completely new society that would be developed, in which case every single aspect about people would be known to the government, and it's going to have a huge impact on how society is run and how society develops itself. It's major. I mean, the U.S. also, when we talk about elections, is the only country that's trying to suppress the vote. They vote on Tuesdays. It's not a national holiday. They don't want to vote by allowing people to vote from their homes, to make sure this is the influence of corporations, big money in politics, those people who actually control politics, and they try to suppress the popular will. We can talk about that in the questions and answers. There's a lot, of course, the impact on the environment, on labor laws, on civil liberties, on immigration, on basic rights of the people. There's so much that this crisis could actually impact because of the conditioning of the people, the psychological impact that it has on people. And of course, it shows clearly the lack of leadership, whether from Trump or his administration, how to deal with this crisis. All right, let me end now on the last section of this, because time is really going, on the geopolitics. Now, when we talk about geopolitics, we have to understand that the US went through 3 phases. The first phase was from the beginning of the Republic all the way until about the end of the 19th century. In other words, from the beginning of the founding fathers until about the 25th president, McKinley. In that, what the US was trying to do is to consolidate its power within the continent, that is to get whatever territory it can get, and then try to turn this into a powerful economic engine so that they can build the capacity inside their own country. And of course, they were very successful in that. And the US came from a very humble beginnings into a dominant world power. Not world power, but at least consolidation in its own region by the end of the 19th century. And then by the beginning of the 20th century, till about the World War II, or the end of World War II, they developed itself into a world power. They started that with the American-Spanish War, when they got Cuba, Philippines, and other. They built a stronger navy. They were able to project power throughout, and of course, they were trying to have the hegemony over their own sphere, or region, North and South America. That went again from about the president to about, which is Theodore Roosevelt, about Truman, the end of World War II. And then it became a world power. In other words, it came to the point where it became a world power. When I say world power, that means it projects power every part of the world. It controls for the international relations between countries in terms of the political entities, the military alliances, the economic, and so on and so forth. IMF, World Bank, United Nations Security Council, NATO, all the regional and global institutions. It sets the rules, and it doesn't play by the rules. For example, the International Criminal Court, all the rules were set by the United States, but it's not party to it, so it does not subject itself to the same rules. The World Trade Organization, certainly it allowed China, because the whole idea was this debate was going on always between the conservatives and the liberals, is how do we deal with China? So one way, the liberals, at least during Clinton, they said, okay, we're going to get eventually China into this, and hopefully that will moderate the behavior of China, and we will be able to control. What I'm trying to say here is every stage, whether it's stage 1, 2, or 3, it has a grand strategy. It has a grand strategy. In other words, a grand objective. Now we have to distinguish between foreign policy, strategy, and grand strategy. Foreign policy answers the question of what? What are we going to do? Strategy answers the questions of how. How are we going to do it? But grand strategy answers the questions of why. Why? So, as I said, there were three aspects of this. Why, at the beginning, was that we need to be a strong country. So we build the capacity in our own strong country. The why in the second stage, the grand strategy, was that we want to be a world power. World power meaning that we can be a power that can actually be contented with, and it can fight for its own interest globally. And of course, trade and others were global things. And at the third stage is now not only I want to be a world power, I want to be the leader of the world. I want to be the ones who is number one. And I want to maintain that status. And to maintain that status, they use the policies of containment, which they were very successful against the Soviet Union, and now they're trying to do, especially the pivot that Obama was trying to do on China and others. And we can talk about that, as I said, in the future, about the different policies. But containment and the balance of power principle is central to this. So what we had in the past, since the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of America as the sole superpower, or at least as the strongest and most powerful nation, is that we had Bill Clinton, who actually tilted towards the first principle, which is to rebuild the capacity of the US and then try to project power. And then Bush came, who neglected a little bit of the inside and tried to project power militarily, especially after 9/11. And then Obama came and stressed the third principle, which is basically building alliances and using containment in order to check the power of other countries, because they wanted to maintain the status of the US. The problem with Trump is that he is not being faithful to any principle. He is not building the US. Now they're talking about perhaps an infrastructure bill that will add to the deficit another $2 trillion. I mean, it's just another trillion after trillion. So he's not adhering to that. He is not trying to project power throughout the world. Actually, he is haphazard, and he is confusing actually his policy strategists in the Pentagon and others. He is breaking all the rules of the past. He is having these problems, unnecessary problems with his own allies. They cannot read him very well, whether in Europe or Asia or other places, the Middle East or whatever. And he's not building alliances. He's not projecting real power outside, and he is not building. So he knocked off all the three principles that the U.S. has been living with for centuries. So to conclude, then we are at a situation that could actually be on the wane. And a lot of people think that is the case. However, we have to know that there is no other country that could come and take its place. See, when Britain was at the turn of last century, the premier power in the world, the US was knocking on its heels and saying, I'm coming. Today, a lot of people talking about China. We can spend maybe an hour talk why China, in my view, is not able or willing to take that role. No one's yet, because another aspect, of course, is culture. The internet and English and Hollywood and other aspects of culture is very important in how you shape the word to your image and how you make the word adhere to your will. China cannot reach that. The best China could do in the next 50 years or so is to become perhaps a hegemon in its own sphere, and even the US is working very hard for that to never happen again. So to conclude, since we're almost only 2 minutes, I just want to say that this was an eye-opening in terms of of what happened to the US. There will be a huge impact, philosophical, even existential, psychological, on the population. It showed the complete deterioration and of the infrastructure, and also how in a welfare state, how that infrastructure is collapsing. It shows the ability of the federal government to print money with no consequences, but the impact is not going to be long lasting because it's mostly just going to sustain what's happening. It shows also the problem with globalization and how that concept is no longer operable, not the way it was looked at. It shows also the limitation of science and knowledge, that even that small virus that no one could have predicted would come this year has devastated everything that people have shown. It shows also the weakness of democracy as it's practiced in the US, and that the consequence would be the rise of the alt-right and of nationalist tendencies and the other groups who could actually start problems within society, whether with minorities or others. And that gives the possibility that we may go through a transformation, but it's going to be a very slow transformation for a new international system. And that depends on how long this is going to stay, whether it's 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. Let me stop here so that we can take some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami, for all of your insights on the US. I have some questions that have been directed through the chat, and also there are a couple of people with their hands up who would like to give questions from the participants. Let me begin by trying to put together some of the questions that I have received through the chat. The first one I would like to talk about, first question that I would like to say is about the issue of the struggle between lives and livelihood, right? And how the race divide on both of these issues, they've touched on it, has basically exposed the desire for a certain aspect of the American political elite to push for opening up the economy and the debate around that, and how this is completely goes completely down racial lines, right? So that was one issue, especially of the economy. What your speech has shown is that the bailout packages, which are unprecedented, right? These bailout packages expose what people who have been advocating recently as the new Green Deal, right? What motivates them is the modern monetary theory, in which basically, if the American government, as a sovereign country with control over its currency, and especially with the monopoly of the US dollar, is able to print money in this fashion, then, why didn't it print money to alleviate poverty in the US? Why didn't it print money to subsidize healthcare in the US? Why didn't it print money for young, student debt in the US? I mean, there's so many programs for that it could have done already, but it chose not to. But the crisis has shown that it has the capability of doing that all along. So there's that issue. One question that was raised also that I would like to from the participants was, how is this going to impact the Middle East, right? So we know that people have said that the U.S. presidency basically is a unipolar, is the head of the unipolar world system, and as such, it has an unprecedented control and influence over the world of world politics. When we see the U.S. being challenged, and people said that the only thing that would really set the U.S. back was if it engaged in another adventure, war that it couldn't win. And it almost seems that although Trump was trying to avoid such a situation, that the war has been brought to his doorstep, right? But not in terms of like a confrontation with another state, but I mean, a lot of this is, a lot of dealing with the virus is a kind of war in which the US is spending a lot of money and unable to actually, it's unknown whether it'll it will be quote unquote victorious. So the impact of waning American power, right, in the face of this crisis to the Middle East, especially the New Deal. The people and the participants raised the question of the New Deal and its impact on the New Deal. The issue of Turkey and how Turkey stands in this situation, and also the Saudi Arabia as actors in the Middle East. Iran is also involved in that. So how does this impact on the U.S.? Basically, the question is, how does this impact on the U.S., which seems to be devastating, impact the Middle East? I would like to throw in for myself the question of Islamophobia, right? So we have seen that this crisis in other countries has been a source of like very random blaming of Muslims, especially in India, for instance. We have seen that. But also in, I think a week ago or a couple of days ago, there's a tweet from Donald Trump, like, let's see if in Ramzan, these states, these governors are able to shut down mosques the way they shut down churches.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Lots of questions. I'll try to be brief to allow others. I will answer both questions. First, in terms of the money supply and subsidy. We talk about why can't they subsidize a healthcare that would be fairer and that can cover everybody? Why can't they subsidize the student debt and all that? Well, they certainly can print money, but remember, we're talking about winners and losers here. If and this is what the Sanders was talking about. If we're going to have one, let's say, one payer system in the U.S. where government can actually take over the healthcare situation and makes it fairer and better, as well as comprehensive, where everybody is covered. You gotta remember, about 40 to 50 million people are not actually covered by health insurance. They only go to the emergency room. They have no doctor. They don't have no regular visits. They have no protection whatsoever. If someone loses their job, the 22 million today, in a month or two, they could actually even lose their healthcare situation. So they will be on their own, whatever savings they have, or they will see nobody. Now, that means you're transforming the system. There will be losers. Who are the losers? Big pharma. We're talking about insurance companies. We're talking about owners of hospitals, which is because private, most hospitals are private, and others. All these people are going to fight tooth and tail in order to make sure that this is not going to happen. So the money in politics is corrupting this situation. All these people have lobbyists. They have the ability to influence decisions. And because, you know, they have what's called gerrymandering. I didn't even talk about that where you can guarantee that certain parties will become members of Congress because how they manipulate the district, how they manipulate the organization of how districts are elected so that they have less number of people, and they could have, and the Supreme Court says this is okay, this is constitutional. So you could have a state like Florida where the majority could actually vote for Democrats, yet the majority of the congressmen would be Republicans. So anyway, so what I'm saying is money in politics is a problem. The interest, the capitalist system, how decisions are made, all these are problems that will not allow this. The US is capable of dealing with this in terms of its financial don't want to do that, including, by the way, Democrats. They are unable to do it. Even if Bill Clinton or he tried to change the healthcare system, couldn't. Obama tried, couldn't. So they had to compromise. So for this to happen, you have two things. One is that you have to have massive protests from the U.S. American people. You know who the biggest constituency is during these elections are the non-voters. You have 160 million people who vote, actually much less than that. You have about 130 million people who vote, and we have another 150 who do not vote. So 150 million people, they gave up completely on politics, and therefore they're not part to any of this. If somehow it turns out that we can bring even a quarter of these people into the political process, there will be huge things which will not affect the domestic politics of the US, but also its foreign policy. And but there's a lot of machinery. Remember, the media in the US is also complicit, even though you have some fantastic media reports, but the media itself is just another corporations. General Electric, which is a huge corporation, obviously, and it only looks after its own interest, is the owner of one of the major media companies in the whole world, and so on and so forth. Okay, about the other question, which is the impact of U.S. Or the decline of U.S. power in the Middle East. Certainly, this could also, we can spend an hour talking about this, but it will have impact because of the way the U.S. influences many parts of the world, and especially in the Middle East. The U.S. has been in decline. I mean, it has been in retreat in the Middle East. Yet, it's trying to manage this situation by creating much weaker regimes so that they cannot challenge it. With the exception of Turkey, all other regimes are extremely weak. And also Iran also is another regime that's trying to challenge U.S. policy. So what the policy of the U.S. has been is to keep these regimes weak, under its wing, needing its help. We see that especially in the Gulf countries. But when it comes to Turkey and Iran, they have their own policies, which again revolves around the balance of power principle, in order to keep them either busy with other challenges, like Turkey with northern Syria and Kurdish situation. That's why they are arming the Kurds and making sure that the Kurds will always stay powerful so that they can challenge Turkey. That's why they also support Israel to be a strong country, because as Israel stays strong, then the whole Middle East is supposed to stay weak, because these things are, this formula is reciprocal. You know, one goes up, the other goes down, unfortunately, because that's how Israel looks at the whole Middle East, that for Israel to be the supreme power, every other power has to diminish, every other power has to lose power, in fact. So, but the U.S. Certainly is going to affect with this crisis. If the U.S. is impacted, that will have consequences in the area. I can talk for an hour about this, but I'm just giving you the.
Dr. Sami, let's get some of these people who have their hands up. I want to give a chance to speak. Let me. Yes. Afroz, are you there?
Yes. My question is, what these all developments mean to Muslim countries? What impact it will have for the Muslim countries?
Well, let me take three.
That's a good question.
Yeah, let's take three questions, and then we
can. I'll ask. Okay, Shafat, I would like for you to actually ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Hojam. This is Shafat from Indian occupied Kashmir. I would like to ask you a question, like, Hojam, like plagues have a significant impact on the history. You talked about Justinian plague. It paved way for the Muslim civilization after it had a significant impact on Sassanids and Byzantines. And the Great Plague had a paradigm shift in Europe. But what I was looking at the current developments, say the American leadership is in decline. What I could see, I'm asking this question to you, is that the international system, is it going to be a flexible polarity we can witness in the international system, or what kind of prospects it's going to bring to the countries like Turkey and Iran, because every crack we see in the international system is beneficial for the smaller players.
Thank you very much, Shafat. I want to add one more question that was given from the text messages. I mean, from the chat.
You can asking the question. Is he still around?
Yes, 1 second. Yes, Dr. Amr, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. My question is this. You've been referring to the difficulties for any other power to replace the US based on so many things. However, your explanation on the internal dynamics, particularly effects on the economic situation and the unprecedented number of unemployed people, and if you can add to that the moral issues, the lack of family values, and all that, don't you think that there is a possibility for the U.S. to collapse from inside rather than by another power taking charge and defeating it, because nobody else, as you explained, is able to do that. But from inside, people talk, for example, about possibilities of civil wars in case Trump, for example, loses narrowly and he invites his supporters to go to the streets with their weapons and all that and all these discussions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad. Oh, wait, sorry, I accidentally muted Dr. Sami.
Okay. Can I? Am I all right? Am I?
Yes.
Can you hear?
You're back.
All right. Let me answer these three questions very quickly. The impact on Muslim countries. Again, U.S. has a lot of influence in many Muslim countries, but it happens sometimes when a country is occupied with certain things, that country, if it has the will to change, that they may have a window, an opportunity that they can slip through that. I can refer, for instance, to the Iranian revolution back in late 78, early 79, when there was still ambivalence and weakness in the U.S. After Watergate, in which they were able to exploit that window and make that change and impose that change, so to speak. And it's the U.S. has been trying to correct that mistake from their point of view ever since, over 4 decades. I think another opportunity was missed opportunities, I should say, during the Arab Spring. I think it was Obama when he said to Hosni Mubarak, "You must go," on February 10th. He resigned on the 11th. So it does have an impact. But also there are a lot of other counter forces that are trying to make that difficult. So it's all the impact on the Muslim societies. It's really more internal than the external is important. I'm not trying to minimize it, but it's the major impetus is, do we have as Muslim societies that will for change, and then we can impose it at the proper moment. This could be one of these moments that could come and go. I mean, this year and possibly next year, in the next, let's say, 1.5 years, 2 years, there could be so much uncertainty in the world that could allow those who would like to impose a change or work for a change to take place, yet they may not take that opportunity, and then that opportunity closes, and then it becomes, you need another few years before that opens again. That's a major, again, a main observation. The second thing about the prospects of the international system. Well, yes, the international system is pretty much stacked in favor of the United States. They built it. They set the rules, and whoever sets the rules and try to make sure that it maintains the rules. And by the way, the US paid for that. It didn't come cheap. They subsidized NATO so that they can be the premier military forces in the whole world. They subsidized NATO with hundreds of billions of dollars every single year for the past 5 decades, 6 decades. All right, so there's a price to pay, and they're willing to pay that price in order to maintain that control and hegemony. Now, if Trump is trying to maintain control and hegemony while having others also to contribute or pay and this and that, that's going to have an impact. And I don't see Trump, frankly, being a person who understands these things. Of course, doesn't mean that he's not going to prevail, because the U.S. president is very powerful. But I think also that it depends what's going to happen at the end of the year. If Trump somehow is reelected because they're able to manipulate the system, the electoral college system, and money and politics and all that, then I think it's going to be a monumental shift in the next few years about U.S. power, because this guy is not adhering to any rules or principles that maintained American hegemony and power. And that's going to have an impact, even though those who are in the know, they don't like it, but yet they're not going to win the day because of his personality. However, if Biden becomes the president, then I think he's going to go back to the policies of the neoliberal elites there, very similar to what Obama and others tried to lead. Obama said lead from behind, trying to assemble another alliance, in which case the U.S. will try to lead. And of course, other forces were trying to get piece of the action, whether But I will discuss, I promise you, I will discuss whenever we discuss the geopolitics of the US, these challenges from the geopolitical point of view and why China will not be able to. And that gets me to the third question by Dr. Amir about the US collapsing from inside. I mean, it's possible theoretically, but practically it's almost impossible, because civil war in the US, even though a lot of people have been talking about it, it's not an easy, I mean, you can start one, but you cannot win. The exercise that they had in the 1860s, in the Civil War, where 600,000 plus Americans died, that was the real Civil War. And at that time, you have very weak government. You know, you have the slavery, you have strong states, you have militias. Most of that has been rolled out. So what we have today is a very strong federal government, extremely strong federal government, very weak states. So if you're saying about a state trying to secede, let's take that scenario. Let's say the state of Texas, which is a very big state. Let's say the state of Texas wants to secede from the Union. What can it do? It will recall its National Guard, which is, even though it's under the control of the governor, but in effect, if the president wants, he can control that National Guard, which will not be more than 50,000 people. What can 50,000 do to a million, you know, assuming? They don't have any weaponries, they don't have any planes, they don't have any tanks, they don't have any of that. So they cannot have a real civil war. Then we're talking about militias. Then maybe it's not a political system that's trying to secede, but militias militias will be defeated so easily, not just even by the army, which there is a law actually where the army cannot, there is a law in the US books. An army cannot go into the streets. An army cannot fight inside the United States. That's a fact. National Guards can go, which belong to the states, but the overall commander-in-chief is the president himself. But you have all kinds of security agencies from the FBI down who actually they have the weapons and the ability, if they have militias, to kill them without any consequences. So civil war, in terms of military civil war, it's going to be very difficult. Then the next thing, we're talking about mass protests. We're talking about civil disobedience and shutting down the government for whatever reasons. The US system is so adaptable and flexible that can deal with these things. These things happened in the 60s during the Civil War, the Civil Rights era, in which the system changed so that they can contain and accommodate these people without giving them real gains, but these even nominal gains were enough for these people to basically to accept it. And then the money that is prevalent here, it can buy anybody and any group, and there is so much infiltration by the security forces of most of these groups that's very difficult to see how one group can prevail.
Dr. Sami, I want to give the floor, thank you very much. I want to give the floor to Mr. Anwar Haddam, who has a question.
Okay, great to hear from Anwar.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this wonderful session. Actually, my question is related to the international relations and the aftermath of this virus. There is no doubt that an international community without a hegemonic power or hegemonic powers, it will be a chaotic situation. However, maybe it is time to think not of having just one power, one hegemonic power, but rather a council of powers. What I'm trying to say here that it's becoming obvious that like the European Union, the French, Germany-led European Union collapsed. It's going to collapse because they showed their limitation in helping even European countries, like what happened in Italy, etc. We see the United States absent from the international scene. So definitely they're going to have a change. We are going to have a change at the international relations. But maybe it is time for us, time for the Muslim community, for the Muslim world, to try to think, to initiate a new Westphalia, but with the idea of having not antagonist powers, but rather a kind of council of powers that will take over the international community in order to keep a certain order that will be fair for everyone, etc. So what do you think about this? Why always thinking of having just one superpower? We keep United States or we change by China. Why not having this kind of council and try for us as a Muslim world to try to work on this and impose ourselves? Of course, nobody is going to give us anything, but we. What do you think about this as a strategy? And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
Are you going to take more questions?
Yeah, I have one more question from Mihraj ad-Din. If Mr. Mihraj can come in here, you have the floor for your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Prof. Sami. It's Mihraj from Kashmir.
Good.
While you were speaking about different sort of shifts which were happening in the US, I was just thinking about this anecdote. Somebody said that every crisis is a new birthplace for a new possibility. So given the crisis within the Muslim world, as you said, that the coming 2 years will be very crucial for the Muslim world also, they can think of creating an alternate platform. So don't you think it is quite difficult for the Muslim world to come together while we are seeing that there is a lot of schism within the Muslim world? As you can see that what was happening about Kashmir recently and the kind of alternative which is coming from Turkey, Pakistan and Malaysia, which was dodged by Saudi Arabia recently, and they were expecting to hold a conference on Kashmir, but they didn't. So this serious political schism and this schism of not having unity within the Muslim world, do you think in such crisis, in such schism, there is any possibility of some Muslim countries coming together as an alternate narrative for the Muslim world?
Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Miraj. I want to ask, there's been a lot of questions in the chat on kind of building on what Brother Anwar said, basically about a post-American world. I mean, Eikenberry has spoken a lot about unipolarity, but recently we've seen that there's a growing multipolarity around the world, and everybody in the chat, I mean, many questions came regarding China. I mean, it seems that China, first of all, was able to overcome the crisis, and it seems like their political system, with a lot of the problems and criticisms that are out there, was able to manage the situation. They have reopened their economy. So there's a big question mark around Chinese power in geopolitics in the face of waning American power. So that's one. Two is that, building on what Brother Anwar said also, that Russia has proposed in many instances, along with President Erdogan, in his famous statement, "The world is bigger than 5," that we need to expand the security.
About Palestinian situation, nothing. Actually, it's the will of the powerful that has been imposing itself. When we talk about even current things, when the whole world wants to have relationship with Iran and not to impose sanctions, which will was imposed on the people? It was the will of, not even of the US as the US, because Obama had a different idea. It's the will of Trump and his Zionist allies, Netanyahu and others. Now the whole world is not actually trading. Forget about the coronavirus. Even before the coronavirus, not trading with Iran. Iran cannot buy medicine, cannot buy food, because that is the reality of the situation. So when we talk about council of powers, who's going to agree to that? The US is going to fight it tooth and nail in trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, what about the others? Is China willing to actually defy the US will? It has the capacity to do that, but it will not do it for a very simple reason. China wants to build its own capacity. What the US was doing 2 centuries ago, or a century and a half ago, that's what China is trying to do. And they're not there yet. They're not even a hegemon in their own hemisphere, in their own region. How can they go and try to challenge the US in different regions of the world? They want to build the capacity, the technology, the military, the navy, the other things, the other instruments of power in order to come and say, okay, now I'm going to take a hard line against the US and I'm willing to pay the price. The US is not going to just relinquish its power peacefully. I mean, if people talked about Germany, all right, how many soldiers does Germany have? 179,000. It cannot even fight Turkey, a medium power, let alone the US. And it doesn't even have the will. I mean, I'm assuming they're willing. They're not willing to do that. But let's say they have the will. Let's say when you have a Hitler, or if you had a Hitler of 8 million soldiers and building the whole German machine, then I can say, okay, that obviously is an upcoming power who's trying to challenge. But we don't have any of that. Russia, on the other hand, it's a declining. I mean, yes, it's powerful. Yes, it has some means, but what is the power of Russia? One, it has a large country with oil, arms industry, and then the will to take some initiatives for its own national interest in terms of security in Ukraine, in Syria, and others. But beyond that, it's nothing much it can do. It cannot offer people much, beyond that. It's not even a political system. And China the same. The problem is you have an appealing, even if they do not adhere to the ideas themselves that the US and other liberal countries trying to sell the people, these are appealing ideals. We don't have that. China is never going to tell people come and use my political system because it's not going to be appealable. Or we're talking about culture, we're talking about politics, we're talking about economy, we're talking about all kinds of instruments of power. So I wish this is the case. Now, talking about Muslim countries, I mean, Muslim countries are so weak. They cannot even have initiatives within their own, let alone things that have to do with international politics. I wish we had more countries like what Erbakan was saying, in which they can cooperate on small things. Erbakan's idea was very simple. I want to get 8 countries where these 8 countries can trade with them and make sure that their trade takes precedence and priority over trades with others. And let's start there. He was trying to build a Muslim, so he has a European market or European community. He was trying to build a Muslim market, a Muslim community. So he chose the biggest 8 countries: Nigeria, Egypt, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Malaysia, Turkey, and so on, so that they can build this, it's like their own Silk Road, so to speak, so that they can at least start somewhere there. That initiative even is dead today. No one's even talking about that, let alone talking about something further that will impact the world at large. So I wish that was the case, but we have to deal with reality. We cannot deal with dreams or talk about ideals that have really no roots in the ground. However, having said that, we do have the potential. If we have a vision, if there's, I mean, obviously there are some candidates here. I mean, we have some countries around the world. They tried in Malaysia a few months ago, but it was very easily defeated because, again, there was no unified vision, and there is no real unity, and there is no attempt to put the interest of the ummah, so to speak, over or nations. See, when nationalism trumps that concept of unity, then nothing works, and we see the impact of that in Palestine, in Kashmir, and different places of the world. About a couple of years ago, a little bit over a couple of years ago, when Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, there was a lot of talk throughout the Muslim world. This is not going to stand. We're going to cut relations with the US over this. This is our red line. What happened? Nothing happened. It was just rhetoric. So if either small things, these, let alone when we talk about hard power and interest that nations have to face, this is difficult. Now, the rise of China, again, this needs really a whole conversation, giving you point by point why China, not even in the intermediate term, not even in the next 30, 40 years, can replace the US in terms of its ability to lead in the same way the US has been leading. That doesn't mean that there is no alternative. I mean, on the long term, there is alternative. There is other ways of doing this, but to do that involves the challenge. And when we talk about challenge, then we're talking about cost. So far, most countries are willing to pay a cost associated with this. It's going to be very difficult for that to happen. And because that's very difficult to happen, no one is attempting it. There's a cost. If Turkey, let's take example, and that's my last point, and talking about Turkey also. There's another point about conservative politics, but let me end in 3 minutes. So if we talk about Turkey, if Turkey wants pay the price to get its policy, that means it has to confront the US. And Turkey is trying to avoid this because there's a huge impact. When Trump says, "I'm going to shut Turkey's economy down,"
here's what I found,
which was a few years ago, it was a huge thing. The lira paid, the lira was devalued by over 30–40%. The recovery in Turkey, I think Turkey has been very aggressive in trying to control and contain this. It has been very generous in trying to give lots of subsidies to some impacted people, the mask free and all that. We'll wait and see. I live here and I hope that this thing is going to be over soon. And I think they're trying to make these balanced things between what always says lives and livelihood. They're not trying to shut down the economy. At the same time, there's a lot of social distancing and curfews and others. And from what I heard from last reports is that they think that we're gonna peak soon, and then hopefully things will go down. We'll see what happens. I don't think anybody has a magic wand in which they can say we're over this. I think this is a global pandemic. It's gonna affect all societies. I don't think one society can recover and the other society is not. Talk about travel, tourist industry, and others. It's a huge thing. The impact on conservative politics, certainly this is going to be the trend of the future. I think there is a whole discussion that we can do about the impact of globalization before even the coronavirus, the COVID-19, and how that's what's waning, and how the rise of the alt-right and the conservative movements was taking place, with impact on Islamophobia, another question, and how Islamophobia was fueled by these people, certainly Trump and others. And let me just make a plug here. We at CIGA are going to have daily, I'm talking about daily lectures from international scholars around the world. We're going to have 30 lectures and 30 scholars every single day in Ramadan, starting day after tomorrow on Friday, between the hours of 3:30 to 5 Istanbul time. And a lot of these questions, a lot of these subjects will be actually on the agenda. They will be presented, and there will be discussions and seminars. So I hope you join us. We are going to announce this either tonight or tomorrow morning with the full schedule every day, what scholar, what topic, and it will be on a different platform. It will be on Microsoft Teams, which will give it a little bit wider audience, but also it will be secure, so no one can actually infiltrate. It will be pretty much tight, and we will give you that link on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for our participants. Thank you, Dr. Sami, for doing our inaugural Zoom broadcast from Istanbul. I really want to thank all the participants. Apologies to anybody whose questions or comments weren't included, but this is a kind of limited platform for us to get everybody's participation. Hopefully we were able to get everybody there. Please stay tuned for other seminars and things that we are preparing for the month of Ramadan, as Dr. Sami said. And once again, I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Assalamu alaikum. Have a great Ramadan.